This instructional video covers how to use decimal notation for fractions with denominators of 10 or 100. You will be able to look at a fraction with a denominator of a 10 or a 100 and represent it as a decimal using decimal place value. Let's start off by reviewing tenths by putting the tenths on a number line. If my number line goes from 0 to 1, we would start with 0 tenths, 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths, 5 tenths, 6 tenths, 7 tenths, 8 tenths, 9 tenths, and the whole would be 10 tenths. If I'm looking at a visual model of fractions, I can count the pieces here to see that I have 10 pieces total, so each piece would be worth 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths, 5 tenths, 6 tenths, 7 tenths, 8 tenths, 9 tenths, and 10 tenths. For example, if I shade in 1 tenth, 2 tenths, and 3 tenths, I would have 3 tenths of this bar shaded. Let's go back to our number line where we represented tenths as fractions. There is another way to represent tenths, and that is by decimals. Like fractions, decimals are pieces that make up a whole, but are just represented by using a decimal point. You may have seen decimals when looking at money. The decimal place represents the cents that do not equal a whole dollar. Let's look at the decimal form of tenths. If I have 0 tenths, that represented as a decimal would look like this. 1 tenth as a decimal looks like this. 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths, 5 tenths, 6 tenths, 7 tenths, 8 tenths, 9 tenths, and 10 tenths equals 1 whole, so it is represented as the whole number 1. When we learned about place value, we started with the ones place and went to the millions place. If we are looking at the number that is currently in the place value chart, it reads as 853. Since we know fractions and decimals are less than a whole, the tenths place is going to be to the right of the ones place. This number represented would look like this. And when we read this number, we say and to represent the decimal. So this number would be 853 and 6 tenths. In expanded form, this number would be 800 plus 50 plus 3 plus 6 tenths. If I'm looking at a visual model of fractions, I know that I can represent tenths as both fractions and decimals. 1 tenth as a decimal looks like this. 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths, 5 tenths, 6 tenths, 7 tenths, 8 tenths, 9 tenths, and 10 tenths equals 1 whole, so it is represented as the whole number 1. So let's talk about hundredths. On this number line, you can see that the hundredths are listed by multiples of 10. Let's zoom in on the number line between 20 hundredths and 30 hundredths. Zooming in on the number line between 20 hundredths and 30 hundredths, you can see we are counting by ones between 20 and 30. This can also be represented by looking at a visual representation. Here's a visual representation like we did before. This is of tenths. This is of hundredths. Each of these squares represents 1 hundredth. 1 hundredth, 2 hundredth, 3 hundredth, 4 hundredths, 5 hundredths, 6 hundredths, 7 hundredths, 8 hundredths, 9 hundredths, 10 hundredths, all the way to 100 hundredths. Like tenths, hundredths can also be represented as decimals. This would be 10 hundredths, 20 hundredths, 30 hundredths, 40 hundredths, 50 hundredths, 60 hundredths, 70 hundredths, 80 hundredths, 90 hundredths, and 100 hundredths is 1 whole, so it's represented as the whole number 1. When we learned about place value, we started with the ones place and went to the millions place. We already know that the tenths place is 1 place after the decimal. The hundredths place is the next place after the decimal, so 2 places after the decimal point. This number would look like this. And again, we would say and when we are reading the decimal place. So this number would be 853 and 67 hundredths. And then represented in expanded form would look like this. 800 plus 50 plus 3 plus 6 tenths plus 7 hundredths. Here's a representation of hundredths. Each of these squares represents 1/100th and is represented as a decimal. Let's look at some examples. If I have the number 7 tenths and I want to be able to represent it as a decimal, it would look like this, 7 tenths. This number has a 6 in the tenths place, so if I wanted to represent it as a fraction, would look like this. This number is 37 hundredths, and if I want to represent it as a decimal, would be 37 hundredths. This number is 52 hundredths, represented as a fraction, would look like this.